Epocrates' general manager, Diane Bartoli's background is a little different from most of my guests. Sure, she has an MBA, but she majored in English, and most of her career has been in publishing, with stints at Random House, Elsevier, and Amazon's Kindle, before she joined Athena Health to lead its Epocrates business. I've followed Epocrates literally for decades, since they started out as a mobile app on the Palm Pilot. When Athena Health acquired Hippocrates about 8 years ago, I interviewed the executive who did the deal. He talked about basking in Hippocrates' love halo and some other interesting rationales. While Diane's been hard at work steering Hippocrates through the pandemic, demand is up for reliable information for clinicians about COVID in particular, and so business is quite good. Unsurprisingly, Diane has a few book recommendations, including The Winter Fortress, written by her husband, Neal Bascomb. And Diane is quick to point out that she mainly reads on the Amazon Kindle. I'm David Williams, host of the Health Biz podcast and president of Health Business Group, a strategy consulting firm that helps healthcare companies like Hippocrates develop robust growth plans. Reach out to me, dwilliams@healthbusinessgroup.com, if you'd like to discuss strategy for your company. Well, Diane Bartoli, VP and General Manager of Hippocrates, welcome to the Health Biz podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're going to talk about Hippocrates in a minute. I always love the name Hippocrates. It's like Socrates. It sounds so official and intellectual. But before we get to that, love to hear a little bit about your background and your education. What was your upbringing like? What were some of your early childhood influences?
So first of all, I'm one of 5 children. I'm the fourth out of 5, the youngest girl, and I have one younger brother. And, I grew up in New Jersey, about 25 miles outside of New York City. I'm first generation. My father was born in Italy and immigrated here when he was a tween, basically. He did not speak any English. He really had no connections here other than the other people who came from his village shortly before him and also did not speak any English. And, he was the first in his family to go to college. And he became ultimately a very successful engineer and was the CEO for an engineering contracting company called Foster Wheeler. And so my experience growing up was, very sort of traditional suburban one and, in a big family. So learned a lot about what teamwork was like and sharing and working out conflict on the daily. But then observing, in particular, my dad and his career, which took him all over the world. And he was really, he loved his job. He loved building things. And, this was something that I only came to realize much later on, that I also love to build things. He also had a tremendous sense of responsibility for the people who worked for him. And actually, one of my earliest memories, he had been bidding on a contract against a competitor, and they lost the bid, which meant that he would have to lay off, I don't know how many people, but I remember feeling like it was a lot of people. And he spent the rest of the day on the phone calling his competitor and saying, you should take these people because they're great. And I can't unfortunately use them because you won the contract. And that really stuck with me, this sense of, one, that the tremendous pride he had in building things and understanding how things worked. He really loved technology as an engineer. And also the tremendous, that it wasn't just the good that they were doing with what they were building, with things like oil refineries and water purification plants or whatever they were building, waste to energy plants. But also that this was a sense of, allowing lots of families to prosper, in the work that they generated. And for me as a leader, those were things that very much informed, how I think about being a leader and prioritizing things. And so those were definitely meaningful parts of my growing up.
It sounds interesting. Some of those things you may have absorbed unconsciously, and then others you come to realize at a certain point, actually are decisions that you make and about how the way you want to operate and to run your career. I will say there's a little bit of a, maybe this is a health biz podcast thing, but being the second to last in a large family seems to be something, because another one of my guests, Frank Jackson, actually, he was the 6th of 7 children. So part of the bonus there is it's like it's a big family, but they had you and they
Yeah.
decided, either you're so great, let's have one more, or this one
No,
didn't work out, let's keep
so
going.
I've only had, so I don't know what this says because I only have two children, but my
Okay.
mother said to me a long time ago, I think mostly in a bid to generate more grandchildren, that they only start really getting good towards the end. And that was basically a byproduct of like, meaning you become a better parent like the more kids that you have, right? You relax a lot, you don't sweat a lot of the details that you sweat with the first and the second one. Those are the ones that really absorb all of your anxiety and your neuroses around parenting. And also she's like, the economies of scale start to kick in. The older ones actually start taking care of the younger ones. So there may be something to that. I also think we just tend to be scrappy. Like, you figure out how to get your voice heard and, your needs met alongside lots of other people. And there's probably something to that too.
Yeah. We have four, and my wife and I are one of three each. And so I don't know what that says. I do know a lot of people that come from a big family, and they typically have one or two. So that tells you something too. My father also told me when we had our first one, he says the only reason to have children is to have grandchildren. So it's like, thanks, Dad. Thanks for
So
letting me know.
absolutely.
So we're still waiting for that. Okay, now you have a little bit of it's not an unusual background, but it's a little different than we usually have on the show because you studied English in college and
Mm-hmm.
then eventually you went and get an MBA. So that I'm
Yep.
more comfortable with that side of it. But why English?
Yeah, so this is another conversation I had with my dad. So I remember actually, I started college with an undeclared, so I did not know what, and I all I knew was that I loved school. I always have, and if I could figure out how to be in school forever, I probably would have done that. And so I loved learning, I loved school, and I was good at math. But I really love to read. And, I was debating, and I said to my father, I was like, sort of debating between being an English major and a philosophy major. And my poor father was like, well, those are one's more useless than the other. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure,
those are my
like,
two choices.
what
Yeah, give me a third choice.
exactly.
Yeah.
He was like, well, neither of them puts you in a position to get any kind of, marketable employment. But I ultimately chose English because ultimately I sort of selfishly was like, well, I get to read novels all the time, which is sort of what I want to do anyway. And so I was a big reader then. And I also thought that I wanted to pursue publishing. And so I did some internships in publishing, and ultimately wound up working in publishing after graduation. I will say that, you know, when I was pursuing business school later, I felt like my English degree was like something I needed to compensate for, and which is part of why I chose to be a finance major in business school. But I ultimately credit actually a lot of any of the success I've had is actually to a lot of what I learned as an English major. So one, the idea of, you know, English, like philosophy, is a lot about rhetoric and breaking down logic and themes and understanding how to kind of understand how things are related to each other, and narrative. And actually, I think as a leader, narrative is like one of the most compelling and important things that you've got to figure out how to share with your customers, share with your employees, share with your stakeholders. That I find that I'm constantly telling stories about what we're trying to do, where we've been, where we're going, and they all have beginning, middles, and ends. They have to have sort of compelling features in them, and it's part of what makes, I think it's frankly, I think also, I'm a pretty good communicator, and that is because of the training I had as an English major. In retrospect, I'm thrilled that that I had that sort of grounding as an English major. And I'm also, frankly, really glad that I went to business school because I got a lot of very good, hard quantitative skills that I just didn't have. And the balance of those two things have served me pretty well as a GM.
So help me with the sort of the through line of the career. So I looked at your LinkedIn profile and it's after school, Random House, PwC, Elsevier for the first time, literary agent,
Yep.
Elsevier again, Amazon, Athena. So what's the narrative behind that one?
So the narrative behind that one is that I tend to follow my interest, right, and go deeper on that. And I will say, so I started in publishing because I thought that I wanted to be in publishing, and I did, and I loved it. I was an editor at Bantam Doubleday Dale, which was then acquired by Random House, so at Random House. And I loved working with authors, and I really loved actually the business. And so I was working at Random House in the mid 90s when Amazon was just coming onto the scene, when the first ebooks were being created. And I was really intrigued and inspired by those things. And I was working at a place that, I was obviously a fairly junior employee, like literally 2 or 3 years out of college at that point. And I was the designated representative of my imprint on some of these like company-wide committees to think about, for instance, digital publishing, which was just like super nascent. And I remember going to one of those meetings, and one of the sort of key takeaways was, well, this has tremendous potential in terms of what rights, that rights will never become vulnerable, right? Because at that point, contracts were written that if you were out of print for some period of time, the rights will become vulnerable and the author could request those rights back.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, one of the people in the room had identified that, well, if it's digital, theoretically, it's never out of print.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yes, that's true. But like, what about the fact that we don't have to worry about inventory management anymore?
Right.
Like that your supply chain costs, I didn't know those words at the time, but like, that it will cost us a fraction theoretically to actually produce books and distribute them. And also, we've had this albatross around our neck in the form of Barnes and Noble, who's garnered all of the control.
Yeah.
They have no presence in the digital market. Like maybe this is an opportunity for us to sort of like move ahead. And so they all looked at me like I had three heads. And I was like, well, and similarly with Amazon, so when we were purchasing new books, like we would like, bid on new, novels and nonfiction books. And part of that was understanding what the competitive history was. So we would go to these reference books. It was called Books and Prints. And it was like this tome, like huge,
yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, like phone books, right? And you would look up like all of the parenting books that were published in, for 4-year-olds or whatever it was you were trying to do. And so when Amazon came out, all the editors like, oh my gosh, it's basically books in print, but online. It's like
Right.
so much easier to do your competitive research. So that was like our first sort of introduction to Amazon. And then similarly, it was like, because Barnes and Noble was it was a real thorn in the side of publishers at the time. It was like, oh, we'll just, we have a new player to kind of like work with. And again, I remember saying, why don't we just set up randomhouse.com? Like, I'm not like, who's heard of Amazon? Nobody. Everybody's heard of Random House. Everybody's heard of John Grisham and Danielle Steele and Belva Plain and all these people that we publish. Like, why don't we just start selling directly? And they're like, oh no, we're not in that business. We're a publisher. We don't do, we don't sell. That's the booksellers do that. But it was like this very weird, constrained thinking that I just assumed I didn't understand. So I went to business school. I was like, well, I obviously don't get it, because I also frankly struggled to understand how we were making money, because we lost money on so many titles.
Yeah.
I ultimately understood like it's essentially a portfolio game, right? So you have your like very expensive, low risk people like John Grisham, right? And they're paying for their cash flow is essentially paying for the rest of the portfolio. But I felt like I was interested in these changes and these shifts, but wasn't in a place that necessarily gave me an opportunity to kind of really explore them or to understand them. So I went to business school, which I loved. And I really, I realized actually I'm way more quantitatively oriented than I would think I was giving myself credit for. And after that, I went to my internship was with PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is now IBM Consulting, and they had a practice focused on media, entertainment, and information. It was called ICE, Information, Communication, Entertainment.
Yeah, before the federal government grabbed that one up, huh?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. It's very different, ICE. And I worked with media companies to do some consulting work for them over the course of my summer that I was there. So this is like 2000. I graduated in 2001. The whole world imploded.
Yeah.
So, they pushed back our start dates because there was like all of the business dried up. And my mentor from PwC had moved over to work for Elsevier. And so he reached out and said, like, hey, would you like to kind of do some work here while you're waiting for your start date? And started doing work for them and never went back, basically. And essentially, I realized like this was the job I ultimately wanted after, a couple of years at a consulting firm anyway.
Yep.
And so Elsevier at that point had just purchased Harcourt. So they had been mostly a science and technical publisher and essentially purchased this huge health science business in Harcourt. And so Brian Nairn, who's the CEO at the time, was mostly focused on essentially digesting this massive acquisition and setting up, this health sciences business. So a lot of product strategy, some M&A too, because we knew there were going to be other acquisitions down the line to kind of fill out the portfolio. But what was interesting about that was, I had gotten into publishing because I love to read. And now I was working at a place where I literally couldn't understand anything we published, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was all, medical textbooks and scientific journals. And, I didn't understand any of it. And so I struggled actually with that a little bit because, the sort of mission orientation, which I've always had, was a little bit at sea. I was like, what am I doing here? I don't even understand exactly what we're publishing. And it was actually, at that point that I decided to start a literary agency with a friend. So I sort of went back to agenting or to the trade publishing side, but this time from an agenting perspective. That was really interesting because it was, a real entrepreneurial effort. Literally your own everything, delivering packages, fixing your own computer. Like there was
Yeah.
no, IT department. Negotiating all the contracts, negotiating our boilerplates. And I really kind of brought, to my partner, the friend of mine who I had started it with, he had great contacts, but I built like a financial model for us to understand like how many deals do we need to do to kind of get to this level? What kinds of authors should we be trying to source? And sort of took that sort of like business approach to kind of driving the business. And I liked it a lot. The part that I found frustrating was I felt like we were working on such a small scale.
Yeah.
So I kept wanting to work, and take my authors, to a much, much larger scale. So one of the first big deals that I did as an agent, I sold like the film rights, the TV rights, the book rights, and all the international rights at the same time to one big partner.
Hmm.
And I loved that because I felt like, okay, great. We have this huge landscape now against which to kind of really, grow this new author. And I just found that so many of our partners were so limited in their thinking and their budgets were super limited, right?
Yeah.
Because they're managing, hundreds and hundreds of authors. So, each of whom is getting a tiny slice of a marketing budget. And it was around that time that the CEO at Elsevier reached back out at me and said, what have you been up to? We'd love to sort of explore having you come back. And at this point now, I had two children. So I had like both kids essentially
Yeah.
while I was on that hiatus, doing the literary agenting gig. And, my perspective changed. So, when you're, for me anyway, becoming a parent and choosing to work was about, a little bit of a value calculation where it was like, if I'm going to choose to spend time away from my kids, I've got to believe that I'm like punching a bunch above my weight in terms of like goodness in the world,
Yeah.
right? So I think it's incredibly important to be a parent and to be a good parent. And if I'm going to, split my time doing that, then I have to believe that there's going to be some sort of X factor of goodness that I'm kind of producing. And so when Brian reached out, I, thought, actually, yes, I get that I don't understand what's in those journals, but the people who are reading those journals are trying to come up with treatments for Alzheimer's and are trying to cure cancer and are trying to figure out how to create a vaccine for AIDS. Like, that's meaningful work. And so, I drew tremendous kind of inspiration from aiding and abetting like people who were doing what I thought was some of the most important work on the planet. So that's sort of what led me back to Elsevier. And also, again, it was like this mission that I really believe in, and also a big position from which to play.
Yeah.
Elsevier is the leader in the space, in the clinical space, from a publishing perspective in terms of content. And so if they're going to do something, it's going to touch virtually every clinician in some way. And so for those reasons, I kind of went back.
Yeah. Then Amazon.
Yeah. So when I went back to Elsevier the second time, when I joined the second time, it was really when I kind of figured out my groove, which was product. And so so you heard me say in the beginning that my dad sort of loved building things, and that was
Hmm.
something that I was sort of late to figuring out. The first sort of inclination I had that I liked to actually make stuff was the first book I ever published. When it arrived from the printer and landed on my desk, I was like, oh my gosh. And it was like this, unremarkable. I don't even remember who the author
Yeah.
was. Like it was not, it was not, the great American novel
Right.
necessarily. But I was like, oh my gosh, it was like a taste of immortality, like forever and ever. This title's going to live on in the annals of the Library of Congress, like this contribution to the romance,
Right.
like whatever. But I just like this physical representation of all this work we had been doing, choosing cover art and, writing copy and all the editorial work. And I was like, it really sort of lit up my endorphins board quite a bit. And that was my first sort of like, indication that I actually liked to make stuff. So when I went back to Elsevier the second time, I did some work from Brian initially, kind of looking at a bunch of sort of strategic projects. And that was in part, he was like giving me an opportunity to kind of look around the organization and figure out sort of where I wanted to kind of go. And I wound up choosing journals and a product job in journals. And I really didn't know anything about software development or product development. But what I was interested in was that I felt like journals, particularly clinical journals with clinical content in them, were sort of this untapped, unrealized wealth of opportunity. Right, all the guidelines are essentially coming from journals and review articles, and they were, there was like this, and I'm sure you've heard the statistic, like it's anywhere from 13 years or 7 years between the time
Yeah.
evidence is published to when it actually hits clinical practice, right? There's that sort of like, can we shorten that window? And to me, this all lived with figuring out how to make journals more accessible, more, agile, more useful, frankly, right? And so I chose to work as a product director in the journals and the clinical journal space. And it was really kind of where I learned, what agile development was versus waterfall, how to be a product leader. And I really loved it. I mean, I came with a very strong sort of strategic bent. I understood market opportunity spaces, unmet needs, you know, things like that. I didn't necessarily understand, how to articulate, technical requirements. So that's a tremendous part of my learning curve was on that, was like just learning how to be a more technically oriented person, understanding what it takes to build software. And so learned quite a bit about that. And once I got going on there, it really just was this steady progression of looking for new problems to solve. I loved spending time with customers, sort of working back from customer problems to identify solutions we could create. I loved the global scale that we were working on, shipping products all over the world, building things that could be localized. And so, spent quite a bit of time there and moving up in seniority, and ultimately wound up as the GM of a portfolio of products that included things like Clinical Key, which I launched with others and conceived of and launched, and then other products as well. Physician order sets, we had nursing care plans, pharmacy products, etc. So after doing all of that, I kind of was at the precipice of what's next,
Yep.
and got a call from Amazon who said, and really all they said was, "This is Kindle, and we're trying to find somebody to run our education business." And I was
Hmm.
like, completely, like my imagination just totally ran away for like
Yeah.
what the possibilities were. And so, felt like, again, the sort of mission orientation, I was super interested in education for all the reasons that I was also interested in healthcare. It's a, important thing in the world and will lead to better lives for lots of people. But also that, frankly, the best disruptor on the planet was like interested in doing something in education.
Yeah.
Um, so I wound up leaving Elsevier and moving to Seattle, and joined I initially started with just the higher education business. And then over the course of the time that I was there, ultimately took on their K-12 business as well. And it was also the first time. So, Amazon, of course, is an extraordinary place for lots of reasons. And I learned a tremendous amount there, both from just working, frankly, at Amazon, but also because it was really my first true GM job. Because I had been a GM in sort of title at Elsevier, but Elsevier was at the time anyway, still is, I think, to a certain degree, a very kind of classically matrix company, right?
Yeah.
So, very functionally oriented. And so while I had a GM title, the salespeople were not reporting into me directly, marketing was not reporting into me directly, development wasn't reporting into me directly. I was accountable for, the business, but didn't necessarily have all the responsibility that went with that accountability. And that changed when I went to Amazon. So they had created or ring fenced essentially a team entirely dedicated to the education segment. And this is actually a fairly common tactic at Amazon. They call it sort of like a single threaded team. And the idea is, so they'll take folks who are wholly focused on one particular problem or market space and remove all the distractions essentially of the rest of the business from them so that they can just focus on that one space. So that is what we had in the education team at Kindle when I was there. And, and so I really learned a lot about like what it is to be a GM, what it is to manage people who know how to do things, that, for instance, that you do not know how to do. So it was the first time I had developers who were reporting to me directly, right? So having to do things like, code reviews and not knowing how to code myself, right,
Yeah.
was a real learning curve. And learning how to sort of audit for performance effectively, right? So when you can't necessarily do those things yourself, and that is, to me, it's like one of the big leaps you have to make as a leader as you progress up. Like, I had done marketing before, I had done product before. Obviously, I had lots of experience with content. I had done sales to a certain degree as a literary agent. I'd negotiated a ton of contracts and deals, and both as an agent, but also in my time at Elsevier. But I'd never had to do, and I had a degree in finance, but I never had to do. I'd never been a lawyer before necessarily, and I'd never developed. Right, and those were two things that I sort of really learned a lot more about when I was at Amazon in particular. And obviously, felt like I got not a second business degree, but a second sort of like leadership degree, in terms of, and I still actually use lots of the things, the sort of mechanisms, the leadership principle sort of methodology. I'm still employing that, regularly, even in my work now.
Yeah, so all of it sounds like very good training for Athena and for Hippocrates. And maybe to give a little bit of history there, Hippocrates is a company that I've followed from a long time, for a long time, maybe from its inception. And what made it different from a lot of the other tools out there was it was something essentially every physician had. They had it on their
Yeah,
Palm
absolutely.
Pilot.
I mean, to me, Hippocrates was like this weird, Elsevier plus Amazon equals Hippocrates.
Yeah.
Like that is, essentially the sort of trajectory, right? So I had been working with the same users, right, that I'm working with now at Hippocrates at Elsevier. But Hippocrates is really is in many ways a B2C business, right? It's primarily we're a mobile app. We do have a website and we have plans for kind of making that, really kind of growing that presence and sort of expanding beyond the app, and touching lots of other services. But it is primarily now a mobile app, and all the sort of things that are true about trying to grow like Duolingo are also true for
Yeah.
Hippocrates, right? Like it's like how to keep people engaged, right? Like, we have a paid subscription offering alongside a freemium offering,
Hmm.
right? Like there are a lot of those sort of in those ways, it's a digital media business. The core difference, obviously, is that we serve clinicians, right? And so the content that we, is highly expert content, right? Our content is being written and generated by a team of clinicians that are in house, right? So, it's not BuzzFeed, it's, no insult to BuzzFeed, but it is,
Right.
it's a highly technical content, right? Used for very specific purposes, right? But we think about engagement and have to think about engagement, and sometimes in similar ways, which is like, how are we being useful to folks? Like, we're not there to entertain people. We're there to make their lives, at work, hopefully easier. Hopefully help them make better choices or the right choices for their patients. How do we become indispensable to them, right? And that is where we generate value. And, one of the things I talk about quite a bit, I did at Elsevier too, but even more so here, which is, at Elsevier, we had sort of a split agency model, right? We had an end user, and then there was a third party, an institutional buyer, generally speaking. We had an individual business too, but most of our business was, large hospitals, medical
Yeah.
schools, et cetera, right? Like buying big licenses. And there, we would often have these debates about, like, the medical librarian or whoever the purchase decision maker was, or chief medical officer, versus the actual end user. Here, I feel like we have much less. We don't have that sort of dual master issue. It's the clinician at the end of the day, period, right? Like,
Yeah.
whatever we need to do to get that clinician engaged, to be useful to them, to have them be, coming back to us regularly. If we can do that, whatever that is that we need to do, we generate lots of value then for our commercial sponsors, for advertising, whether it's advertising or sponsored content. And the same is true for paid subscriptions, right? Like, if we're generating that value, people are happy to pay for a subscription. So in that way, we have a very clear, true north that keeps everybody very much focused on, like, what matters and what we should be building.
When Athena acquired Hippocrates about 8 years ago, I did an interview. It was before the Health Biz podcast, but it was the Health Business blog with Rob Kozanuk at the time. And he said there were three things. And consulting is always three things. You already probably figured that out. But,
Yes.
I'll just
It has
review
to
what
be an
they,
odd number of some kind. Yeah.
yeah, that's how the brain works. But, so the first thing he said, it was going to sidle up to the Epocrates brand and bask in the brand's what he called the love halo to generate. I guess it was a, mid 2010s kind of a thing. That was the first one. The second one is about investing in the core app and make it so that the physicians would love it even more. And the third was integrating the Hippocrates and Athena Health functionality to generate some more transactions on the Athena Health backbone. As you come in, and obviously you weren't responsible for coming up with that or implementing that, did that happen or did something else happen?
So the acquisition was back in 2012, right? And so lots sort of transpired since then. I think, they did make progress, I think, against some of those things. So, for instance, Hippocrates is actually integrated into Athena One, or into the Athena electronic health record system. So the drug data and our interaction check is sort of accessible through Athena in that way. But some of those things, so for instance, like the brand, Hippocrates still has this tremendously valuable brand.
Yeah.
And I do think that, I think people sort of struggled, sometimes to think about, like, why is Hippocrates part of the Athena family? Like, what's the connection here? And the truth is, as and we have obviously new leadership since, beginning of 2019 with Bob Seegert coming on board as CEO. And he's really helped crystallize this idea of, like, building a thriving health ecosystem, that's what we're trying to facilitate at Athena. And to me, Hippocrates is squarely part of that, right? Where we help bring pharma into the ecosystem, which, is really, frankly, critically important. And if people were wondering about that, I think the last year with development of vaccine and fighting COVID helped people remember, if they forgot, about what's so incredibly valuable about pharma as a part of a thriving, healthy ecosystem. but also obviously as the end user, right? So, we're really we're in the pocket, literally, of lots of clinicians, and very much, we share that mission associated with kind of creating a thriving ecosystem, and we're serving the same end user differently, right? So we have different business models, right, that are in some ways complementary to each other, and for lots of different reasons, but very much a shared mission and orientation. And so, we've made, in particular, so obviously I can't speak that much to what happened prior to my joining, but, since the beginning of 2019, and sort of with Bob's leadership coming on board and my leadership, we've had really robust kind of investment in. So we've launched, for instance, continuing medical education. So reintroduce that. That was something that was, provided by Epocrates years ago and was discontinued. We've reintroduced it because we see that there's still quite a bit of demand for it, particularly in a mobile format, and an opportunity to kind of create snackable, continuing education that's available sort of on the go for clinicians. We've launched that. We've launched several other commercial products that are sort of, more data oriented and really helping our commercial clients understand the value of the data that we have, and in how they can understand how clinicians make decisions. What are the factors that they're considering, and putting us in a position to help clinicians make, much better decisions by providing them with very comprehensive information, whether it's diagnostic information, disease information, monograph, data, all of which is, what we call Hippocrates, right? So made to fit on a small screen. Hippocrates obviously started as a mobile app before there were mobile apps.
Right.
It was on a PDA or a Palm Pilot, which was
Yeah.
PDAs, like I'm really showing my age now. So now, I'm a child of the 90s.
Yeah.
So, like that was before there were, which is why it was one of the first mobile apps when the iPhone came out, and featured on the iPhone, because, the the original founders and developers of Hippocrates had conceptualized the utility of a handheld computer, I think, way beyond, where others could even sort of imagine at that point. And so really created a useful tool that actually even drove sales of Palm Pilots, right? People were buying Palm
Yeah.
Pilots just
The
to be able to
so-called
use Hippocrates.
so-called killer app. So
That's right.
what's happened during the pandemic? How has Hippocrates been used, during this difficult time?
So, we saw some interesting things happen, right? Because, so one hand, right, we had to introduce and, very quickly make a coronavirus sort of hub available, right? Or like, a place for information, because particularly the first year, and the first, like very early on in the pandemic, there still is today. The CDC came out with new guidance on mask wearing. It just has clinicians spiraling yet again about, like, what should we be telling patients to be doing? Like, what are we supposed to be? And that's been, so in lots of ways, it's actually driven up demand for solutions like ours, like looking for guidance about what should we be telling patients. Is it safe to give a nursing mother this vaccine, for instance, right? And so we created a coronavirus hub, and we definitely saw engagement sort of grow, particularly early on in the pandemic, even though patient visits and script volumes were dropping, right? So
Right.
one of the indicators that we were seeing, or we look to, one of the sort of key metrics is script volume, because, while we have lots of information available in the app, the thing that people generally come to us over and over and over for is related to script writing, right? They're checking dosing. They want to make sure that there isn't going to be a problematic interaction with other things that the patient may be on. So script volume is a real leading indicator for us in terms of demand for the information on our platform. So it was one of the few times that we saw script volume, particularly new script volume, drop, and demand in terms of our, app go up, right? Because there was just such a desire for information about, how they should be answering patients' questions and trying to, get up to speed. And it was one of the places where we saw, and for years, frankly, right, physicians have been sort of haunted by the Googling,
Yeah.
patient who comes in and has already diagnosed themselves and is sharing several, studies with you about, I've decided I have this condition and here's a clinical trial I'd like you to get me into, right? And, the physician is on their back foot trying to like unravel all of that. That's been true for a while now. And I think a lot of physicians are a lot more, a lot better at trying to sort of stay on top of things ahead of their patients. Coronavirus, COVID, just threw all that on its head, right? Like their ability to stay ahead of the patient was almost impossible, right? The
Yeah.
information was coming out so frequently and there was such a huge volume of it and a lot of it was contradictory, right? So that really kind of drove demand for information. And, it's where we really benefited, frankly, from a trust perspective, right? So we have really high trust scores. It's something that we're really proud of in terms of maintaining really high quality content and very highly trusted content. And so we were a go-to source for a lot of people during that time. The other play on the business side, we certainly benefited because, pharmaceutical budgets, which, the largest percentage of their pharmaceutical marketing budgets generally go to in-person visits, right?
Right.
With reps calling on physicians. Well, none of that could happen with COVID, right? So all of that was having to go virtual. Those companies were sort of scrambling to get those kind of capabilities up and in place. And we certainly benefited from seeing a migration of those budgets into digital channels like ours. So, we saw demand kind of go up in terms of information and utility in the app. And we also saw that easily monetized, in terms of the commercial opportunities on the other side.
So last question is one I ask everybody, but I'm confident that you can answer it, which is, are you reading any books and do you have anything to recommend and maybe conversely anything, to recommend to stay away from?
So yes, I am reading many books. I will say that this is one of the vestiges of my time at Amazon. I read almost exclusively on Kindle, which I would have been scandalized if you told me that 10 years ago,
Yeah.
but it's true. So I'm actually reading Anxious People right now, which is really fun. And I definitely recommend. And it's a little bit of a palate cleanser after some of the I read Cast, which I also really, really
Yep.
recommend. And but reading Cast, it's a lot, it's a
Right.
lot to digest. It's also, emotionally and intellectually. And so I kind of needed a little bit of a palate cleanse, like a little sort of light read after that. So I'm reading Anxious People. I also would be remiss not to promote my husband, who is an author. So I actually met him in publishing years ago. He was at the time a literary agent and I was an editor, but he's since left and has been writing books full time. And he writes narrative nonfiction. His name is Neal Bascomb, and his books are great. They're true stories that read like novels. The Winter Fortress is a particularly great one about World War II and Norway and the saboteurs who took down the heavy water plant there. So I highly recommend that.
Great. Excellent. So that is a first. We haven't had that yet. Terrific. Well, Diane Bartoli, VP and General Manager of Hippocrates, thank you for being a guest today on the Health Biz Podcast.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It's been super fun.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.